In June of 2014, 25-year-old Clara Hayes, a geologist and aspiring writer from Boulder, Colorado, drove her Jeep into the vast, searing emptiness of Death Valley. She was chasing a story for her blog, a personal quest to document the hidden geological wonders of America's most inhospitable landscapes. She was supposed to be gone for a week. 10 years later, in the summer of 2024, a pair of off-road enthusiasts exploring a remote canyon found a rusted, bullet-scarred gas can wedged between rocks. Inside, sealed in a Ziploc bag, was a water-damaged journal. Before we uncover what was written inside that journal, and the disturbing detail investigators almost missed, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like, so more people can help bring stories like this one back from the silence. An analysis of the faded ink and the few legible entries confirmed it belonged to Clara Hayes. The discovery reopened a cold case that had long been surrendered to the desert, and the journal's cryptic final words would prove that Clara hadn't just been lost to the elements. She had met someone out in the silence, and the desert had kept their secret for a decade. The sun in Death Valley is not a gentle source of life, it is a palpable, oppressive force. In the early summer of 2014, it beat down on the cracked earth with a fury that bleached the very color from the landscape, leaving behind a palette of scorched rock and shimmering haze. This was the world Clara Hayes chose to enter. Her friends and family back in Colorado saw her obsession as a form of madness, a strange romance with desolation. Her father, a retired civil engineer named Martin, understood it better than most. He had taught her to read the earth, to see the stories in strata of rock, the epic poems written in sediment and time. Her blog, The Earth's Underside, was a testament to this shared passion. It was filled with beautiful, lonely photographs and prose that was both scientific and poetic. For this trip, her focus was a series of little-known pegmatite dikes rumored to be hidden deep within the Panamint Range, formations that supposedly held crystals of unusual size and clarity. "Going to find the Earth's jewels," she had written in her last email to her father. "Don't worry, I'll have more water than a camel and more maps than a cartographer." He recalled the message with a painful clarity, the casual confidence in her words, a confidence that the desert seemed to prey upon. She was last seen on the morning of June 12, 2014, at a dusty, sun-bleached gas station in a small town on the edge of the park. The cashier, a man whose face had been weathered into a permanent squint, would later tell investigators he remembered her distinctly. "Not many folks head out that deep alone," he'd said, his voice a dry rasp. "She bought 2 cases of water, a bag of ice, and every bag of beef jerky I had. Filled up her Jeep and 3 extra gas cans. She had a map spread out on the hood, a real one, paper, not some phone screen. She seemed like she knew what she was doing." This detail, that she seemed prepared, would become a central and agonizing part of the narrative. When she failed to check in on her scheduled satellite phone call 3 days later, her father wasn't immediately alarmed. The signal could be unreliable in the canyons. But when a full week passed, a week of deafening silence, he made the call that would set in motion the official search. Her meticulously planned route was the first and only guide. A red line drawn on a topographical map showed her intended path into the remote, trailless backcountry. It was there, at the mouth of a wide, gravelly wash marked on her map as unnamed, that park rangers found her dark green Jeep. The vehicle was parked, not crashed. It was locked. The key was not in the ignition. It was not on the ground, nor was it hidden on the vehicle. One of the extra gas cans was missing. Inside the Jeep, everything was in its place. Her sleeping bag, her cooler with its melted ice and a few remaining food items, her geology textbooks. But her main backpack, her camera, her satellite phone, and the missing gas can were gone. It was as if she had parked her car, packed her essentials, and walked off into the furnace of the desert with the intention of coming back. The first set of footprints leading away from the Jeep were clear, the distinct tread of her hiking boots pressed into the firm sand. They went on for about 100 yards, straight as an arrow, heading deeper into the canyon. And then, they just stopped. Not scuffed, not joined by other tracks. They simply ceased to exist, as if she had been lifted straight up into the blank, indifferent blue sky. The official search for Clara Hayes began under a sun that felt like a physical weight. The air temperature hovered around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ground radiated a heat so intense it could cook the soles of your boots. The Inyo County Search and Rescue Team, a hardened group of professionals and volunteers, knew the odds were stacked against them from the start. In this environment, a person without water and shade could perish in a matter of hours, not days. The initial search was a model of procedural efficiency. They established a command post near where her Jeep was found, a small cluster of vehicles and tents that looked like a tiny, fragile outpost against the immense, brutal scale of the landscape. Helicopters sliced through the superheated air, their rotors beating a rhythmic pulse against the silence of the canyons. Searchers on foot, their faces wrapped in cloth against the sun and dust, moved in grid patterns, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign, any scrap of color that wasn't the uniform tan and brown of the desert. The place where her footprints stopped became the agonizing epicenter of the mystery. A canine unit was brought in, a pair of German shepherds trained for wilderness trekking. The dogs followed the scent from the Jeep with an eager intensity, their noses to the ground. They led their handlers directly to the spot where the last visible footprint was recorded. There, they grew confused. They whined, circled, and looked up at their handlers as if the trail had been a thread that was suddenly and inexplicably snipped. One of the veteran trackers on the team, a man who had spent 30 years finding lost people in the Sierras and the Mojave, described it in his report with a tone of professional bafflement. The track termination is abrupt and shows no signs of struggle, no dragging, no deviation in gait. It is inconsistent with a standard lost person scenario. It is as if the subject vanished mid-stride. They widened the search. Teams rappelled into narrow slot canyons, their walls a cool, shadowy relief from the inferno above. They peered into abandoned mine shafts, their flashlight beams cutting through decades of darkness and dust, revealing nothing but the ghosts of old prospectors. The helicopter crews used thermal imaging at dawn and dusk, hoping to catch a heat signature against the cooling rock. They found coyotes, desert bighorn sheep, and the occasional hardy lizard. They did not find a human. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of hope and crushing disappointment. Each morning began with a briefing, a review of the maps, and the assignment of new search areas. Each evening ended with the return of exhausted, dehydrated teams, their faces grim with the day's lack of progress. The media began to circle, their satellite trucks a strange, high-tech counterpoint to the raw, primitive landscape. The story of the missing geologist from Boulder became a brief, flickering item on the national news, another cautionary tale about the unforgiving nature of the American West. After 2 weeks, with resources stretched thin and the probability of survival effectively at zero, the Inyo County Sheriff held a press conference. His face was tired, his words carefully chosen. He praised the efforts of the search teams and expressed his deepest sympathies for the family. The active search, he announced, was being suspended. It would be reclassified as a recovery mission, with rangers and park staff continuing to monitor the area. But everyone understood what this meant. The desert had won. The official theory, the one that would be entered into the file, was simple and logical. Clara Hayes had likely sought shelter from the heat in a small cave or under a rock outcropping, become disoriented or incapacitated, and succumbed to hypothermia. The desert was vast, and its ability to hide its victims was legendary. Her body, the sheriff implied without saying the words, might never be found. For her father, Martin, the suspension of the search was not an ending, but the beginning of a different, more solitary kind of torment. He refused to leave California, moving into a small, sterile motel room that became his own command post. The official narrative felt wrong to him, a neat and tidy explanation for something that felt jagged and incomplete, the footprints that just stopped. The missing key, the calm, deliberate state of her locked Jeep. These were not the signs of a person who had simply gotten lost. These were the signs of an interruption. A year after Clara's disappearance, the case had turned cold, a thick file in a metal cabinet at the Inyo County Sheriff's Office gathering dust. For the world outside, she had become a statistic, another name on the long list of people claimed by the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Death Valley. But for her father, Martin, time had not moved on. It had fractured on the day the search was called off, trapping him in an endless loop of grief and unanswered questions. He had turned the guest room in his Boulder home, the one Clara used when she visited, into a war room. The walls were covered in topographical maps of the Panamint Range, crisscrossed with lines and annotations in his precise engineer's handwriting. He had bought every book ever written about the geology of the region, every historical account of the prospectors and pioneers who had tried to tame it. He spent his nights on the internet, scrolling through forums for hikers and off-road enthusiasts, looking for any mention of strange occurrences, any post from someone who might have been in the park around the same time. His life became a forensic investigation into his daughter's last days. He reread every entry on her blog, The Earth's Underside, dissecting her words, searching for hidden meanings or clues he might have missed. He printed out her photographs of desolate landscapes and pinned them to the wall, staring at them for hours as if they might reveal a secret. He saw her fascination not just with the rocks, but with the emptiness itself, the stories of those who had passed through and vanished. He found one post, written a few months before her final trip, that now seemed eerily prescient. She wrote about the concept of ghosts in the landscape, not supernatural beings, but the imprints of people and events left on a place. Every abandoned mine, she wrote, every rusted piece of machinery half buried in the sand is a kind of ghost. A testament to a life that met its match against the indifference of this land. Sometimes I feel them when I'm out here alone, the silent witnesses. The silence was what now consumed Martin. He called the sheriff's office once a month, a call the receptionist came to expect and dread. His questions were always the same. Any new developments? Had anyone reported finding anything? The answer was always a polite, weary no. The lead detective on the case had retired, and the new generation of deputies knew Clara Hayes only as a name on a cold case file. The years passed. 5 years. 7. The pain did not lessen. It simply changed shape, hardening from a sharp, open wound into a dense, heavy ache that he carried with him everywhere. He sold his engineering consulting firm, telling his partners he needed to focus on personal projects. His project was Clara. He made a pilgrimage to Death Valley every June on the anniversary of her disappearance. He would drive his own truck out to the place where her Jeep had been found and stand there, staring into the immense silence of the canyon. The landscape that his daughter had loved now felt like a personal enemy, a vast, unfeeling entity that had swallowed her whole and refused to even spit out a bone. Local legend had begun to absorb Clara's story. In the bars and diners in the small towns bordering the park, her tale was told with a mixture of reverence and superstitious fear. She became the geologist ghost, the woman who walked into the sun and never came back. People claimed to see a lone female figure hiking in the distance in the shimmering heat, only for her to vanish when they got closer. Martin heard these stories, and they filled him with a cold fury. His daughter, his brilliant, vibrant, scientific daughter, had been reduced to a campfire tale. On the 10th anniversary, he did not make the trip. He was 72, and his doctor had advised against exposing himself to the extreme conditions. He stayed in his war room, the air thick with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. He looked at the maps, the photos, the printed-out blog posts. It was a shrine to a ghost, he realized. Not the ghost of the desert, but his own. That evening, he received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize, a number with a California area code. It was a young, hesitant voice on the other end, a deputy from the Inyo County Sheriff's Department. The deputy cleared his throat, his words formal but tinged with an underlying excitement. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I'm calling because, well, something's been found. The summer of 2024 was even hotter than usual. The heat waves that rolled across the Mojave Desert were relentless, turning the backcountry of Death Valley into a landscape of pure survival. It was in this extreme environment that two men, a father and son on an annual off-roading trip, made the discovery that would change everything. They had been trying to find a route through a little-used canyon, a place far from any designated trails, when a tire on their modified rock crawler blew out. Stranded, they set about the arduous task of changing the massive tire under the oppressive sun. It was during a search for a flat rock to use as a jack stand that the son, a college student named Ben, saw it. Wedged deep in a fissure between two massive boulders, almost completely obscured by shadow, was a flash of rusted red metal. It was an old gas can, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. It was dented and scarred, peppered with what looked like small-caliber bullet holes. It seemed like just another piece of desert detritus, the junk left behind by prospectors or hunters from a bygone era. But something about its placement seemed deliberate, almost hidden. Curiosity overcoming the heat-induced lethargy, Ben and his father worked for 20 minutes to pry it from the rocks. The can was surprisingly heavy. The cap was rusted shut. Using a wrench from their toolkit, they managed to break the seal. They expected to be hit with the smell of stale, evaporated gasoline. Instead, there was no smell. They tipped the can over, and a cascade of sand and fine gravel poured out. And then, something else slid out, wrapped in the grimy but intact plastic of a large Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was warped, and its pages were stained and swollen from humidity, but it was unmistakably a journal. The first page was almost completely illegible. The ink bled into a faint blue watercolor. But on the second page, in a handwriting that was shaky but clear, was a name and a date. Clara Hayes. June 2014. The father recognized the name immediately. He was a longtime desert enthusiast and remembered the news stories from a decade ago, the tragic, unsolved mystery of the missing geologist. They knew, in that instant, what they had found. They carefully placed the journal back in the gas can, loaded it into their vehicle, and, after finishing their repairs, drove directly to the nearest ranger station. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the Inyo County Sheriff's Department. Cold cases are rarely so dramatically resurrected. The journal was handled with the care of a sacred artifact. It was sent to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, a place equipped with the technology to restore and analyze documents damaged by time and the elements. The gas can itself was examined. The bullet holes were confirmed to be from a .22 caliber firearm. The sand inside was analyzed and found to contain minerals that were not native to the canyon where it was discovered, suggesting it had been moved from another location. While the lab in Quantico began its painstaking work, a young, ambitious detective named Isabella Rossi was assigned to the reopened case. Rossi was new to the cold case unit, but she had a reputation for being relentless, for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. She started by pulling the original case file, a box of documents that was nearly as weathered as the journal itself. She spent 2 days reading every report, every witness statement, every transcript of an interview. She was struck by the same inconsistencies that had haunted Martin Hayes for a decade: the locked Jeep, the missing key, the footprints that just stopped. And now, this. A journal, her most personal possession, deliberately hidden inside a gas can, miles from where her vehicle was found, in a place she had no logical reason to be. This wasn't the trail of a person who got lost. This was the trail of a person who was trying to leave a message. Rossi's first official action was to call Martin Hayes. She had read the notes in the file about his monthly calls and his obsessive personal investigation. She knew she was not just delivering news. She was reawakening a hope that he had likely learned to live without. She told him about the journal, her voice steady and professional, trying to temper the information with caution. The journal was damaged, she explained. It might not tell them anything. But as she spoke, she could hear the change in the old man's breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of a decade of stored-up air being released all at once. The first report from the Quantico lab was a mix of triumph and frustration. Using multispectral imaging and digital enhancement, they had managed to recover roughly 60% of the journal's text. The other 40% was lost forever, the ink molecules having completely leached out of the paper fibers. The legible portions were sent to Detective Rossi as a series of high-resolution images. She printed them out and laid them across a large table in the evidence room, creating a mosaic of a mind in its final days. The journal began as expected. Clara's entries were a blend of geological observation and personal reflection. She described the sublime, terrifying beauty of the landscape, the way the light changed on the canyon walls, the deep silence that felt older than time. She wrote about the pegmatite dikes, her excitement at finding small tourmaline crystals, her frustration that the larger formation she was seeking remained elusive. There was a sense of profound solitude in her early entries, but it was a solitude she had sought, one she cherished. Then, about a third of the way through the legible text, the tone began to change. The shift was subtle at first. An entry dated June 15th, the day after she was last seen, contained a single, unsettling line. "I'm not alone out here." The next entry was more detailed. She described seeing a glint of light in the distance, high up on a ridge, like sunlight reflecting off a pair of binoculars. She dismissed it as a trick of the heat, but the idea seemed to linger. "The feeling of being watched is a primal thing," she wrote. "The desert is full of eyes, coyotes, birds, lizards. But this feels different. This feels human." Her geological notes became less frequent, replaced by observations of a different kind. She started documenting things that seemed out of place. A set of tire tracks, not from a Jeep or a truck, but from something smaller, like an ATV, in a location miles from any known trail. A cairn of stacked rocks that was not marked on any of her maps. And then, the first direct mention of a person. "Saw him today," she wrote. The handwriting noticeably more hurried. Just a figure in the distance, too far to see a face. Dressed in dark clothes, which is insane in this heat. He was just standing there, on a rock outcropping, watching my camp. By the time I got my camera with the long lens, he was gone. The journal was becoming a logbook of fear. Clara's descriptions of the landscape, once filled with awe, were now tinged with paranoia. The shadows seemed to lengthen. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing, charged with an unseen presence. She wrote about moving her campsite twice, trying to find a more secluded spot, but the feeling of being watched persisted. She never described a direct confrontation. The man, as she called him, remained a phantom, a distant silhouette that would appear and disappear, a ghost on the edge of her vision. Detective Rossi read these entries with a growing sense of dread. This was not the journal of a woman succumbing to dehydration and delirium. This was the rational, terrified account of a woman being stalked. Then came the final legible entries. The handwriting was now a barely controlled scrawl. "He's left things," she wrote. "Outside my camp during the night. A dead bird on a rock. A circle of black stones. Symbols. I don't know what they mean, but they feel like a violation. This isn't a game. He's closing in." The last entry was a single fragmented sentence written across the page at a frantic angle. "The glass eye sees. He knows my name. Gas can. Must." The sentence ended there. The rest of the page was a smear of blurred ink, as if the journal had been slammed shut in a hurry. Rossi stared at the words. The glass eye. It was a bizarre specific detail that felt like a key, and the mention of the gas can was a chilling confirmation. Clara had hidden the journal herself. She knew she was running out of time, and this was her last desperate act. It was a message in a bottle thrown into the vast, dry ocean of the desert, a bottle that had taken 10 years to wash ashore. Detective Rossi now had two crucial, if cryptic, clues from the journal: the phrase, "the glass eye," and the mention of strange symbols. She knew that to understand them, she needed to see what Clara had seen. She requested all of the original evidence from the 2014 search, including the contents of Clara's Jeep. Among the geology textbooks and camping gear was a box containing Clara's personal effects, including several memory cards for her camera. The camera itself was never found, but Clara had been in the habit of swapping out cards frequently and mailing them home to her father as a form of backup. Martin Hayes confirmed he had a small collection of them, which he had looked at 1,000 times but was not willing to see with new eyes. Rossi, along with a digital forensics team, began the painstaking process of examining every single image on the recovered cards. There were thousands of them. Most were exactly what one would expect: majestic, sweeping landscapes of rock and sky. But Rossi wasn't looking at the mountains. She was looking at the edges of the frame, the deep shadows, the distant ridges. Using powerful zoom and enhancement software, they began to hunt for anomalies. It took 3 days. On the 4th day, a junior technician called Rossi over to his screen. He had isolated an image taken with a telephoto lens, a shot of a distant, unremarkable ridgeline. But when When he increased the exposure and contrast in a small, shadowy portion of the image, a shape began to emerge. It was a human figure, standing partially silhouetted against the sky. The resolution was poor, but they could make out a few details: a wide-brimmed hat, a long coat that seemed impossibly thick for the desert heat, and something glinting in the sun where his face should be. The forensics team couldn't be sure, but it was consistent with light reflecting off a piece of glass. "The glass eye," Rossi whispered, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the office. The figure in the photograph was the ghost from the journal made real, but he was still just a silhouette, a faceless phantom. The symbols were the next piece of the puzzle. Clara had described them as being left near her camp. Rossi went back to the photographs, this time looking for anything that seemed unnatural in the landscape. She found it in a series of close-up shots of rock surfaces, photos that a casual observer might dismiss as simple geological studies. But Clara had been photographing something specific: petroglyphs, rock carvings. These were not the famous ancient carvings found in other parts of the park. These were crude, modern, and deeply unsettling. They were geometric shapes, spirals, and sunbursts, but interwoven with them were stick figure representations of violent acts. A figure with a rock raised over another prostrate figure. A circle of figures surrounding a lone figure in the center. Rossi sent the images of the carvings to a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, an expert in both ancient and modern symbology. His response came back within a day and was deeply disturbing. The symbols were not from any known Native American tradition. They were, in his words, idiosyncratic, a private visual language. "This is the work of one person creating their own mythology," the professor wrote. "It speaks to a deep-seated narcissism and a desire to impose one's own meaning onto the landscape, to claim it. The violence in the imagery is not symbolic, it is narrative. This person is telling a story of their own power and dominance over others." Rossi now had a partial profile of her suspect. He was a man who lived in or spent significant time in the most remote parts of the park. He was a survivalist, comfortable in extreme heat. He wore distinctive clothing. He was territorial and saw himself as a powerful, mythic figure. He had a glass eye, and he had a habit of carving his violent fantasies onto the ancient rocks of the desert. The search was no longer for a random criminal. It was a hunt for a specific, highly unusual individual. Rossi began a new, more focused investigation, a deep dive into the human landscape that bordered the park. She started pulling records of everyone who lived on the remote properties that backed up against the wilderness, cross-referencing names with old police records, looking for anything, anyone that fit the profile. She was hunting for the desert's own unique monster. The search for a man with a glass eye in a sparsely populated region like Inyo County was a daunting task, the search for a needle in a continental haystack. Detective Rossi knew she couldn't rely on standard police procedures. She had to immerse herself in the local culture, the world of the desert rats, the old-timers, the recluses who lived on the fringes, far from the reach of conventional society. She started spending her off-duty hours in the dusty bars and VFW halls in the small towns that dotted the highway, places where local history wasn't written down but passed around in the form of stories and rumors over cheap beer. She didn't introduce herself as a detective. She was just a curious newcomer, interested in the old mining claims and the characters who had populated the desert over the years. She listened more than she talked. She heard stories about UFO sightings, clandestine government operations, and prospectors who had struck it rich and drank themselves to death. And woven into this tapestry of local lore, she began to hear whispers of a figure known as the Curator. The Curator wasn't a ghost. He was a real person, though no one seemed to know his actual name. He was a recluse who lived somewhere deep in the Panamint Range, in an old, unmapped mining claim. He was described as a man who believed the desert was his own personal museum, and he was its sole guardian. The stories about him were contradictory. Some people said he was a harmless eccentric who collected old mining equipment and rare minerals. Others told darker tales. They said he was fiercely territorial, that he would run off anyone who strayed too close to his claim, sometimes by firing warning shots from a distance. They said he would curate the desert, moving rocks, creating strange sculptures, and carving symbols on the canyon walls. No one had gotten a good look at him in years, but an old-timer in one of the bars, a man with a memory stretching back half a century, recalled a detail that made Rossi's blood run cold. "Yeah, I remember him from way back," the old man slurred, his voice thick with whiskey. "Used to come into town for supplies once a season. Mean-looking fella. Had a bad eye, a glass one. Looked right through you." Rossi now had a name, or at least a title, to attach to her phantom: the Curator. The profile fit perfectly: the reclusiveness, the territoriality, the obsession with the landscape, the carvings, and, most importantly, the glass eye. The next step was to find him. His claim was unmapped, which meant it was likely an old, abandoned mine that he had simply occupied. Rossi, along with Martin Hayes, who had become an invaluable, if unofficial, partner in the investigation with his deep knowledge of the area's geography and history, began to cross-reference old mining survey maps from the early 20th century with satellite imagery of the Panamint Range. They were looking for any sign of habitation in the most remote, inaccessible areas: a structure, a vehicle, a trail that wasn't on any official park map. After weeks of painstaking work, they found it. A faint track, barely visible on the satellite photo, snaking its way up a steep canyon. The track ended at a spot marked on the old survey map as the Opal Eye Mine. The name itself seemed like a cruel joke. At the end of the track, the satellite image showed a small, dark shape that could be a cabin or the entrance to the mine itself. Rossi knew she had enough for a search warrant, but it would be a high-risk operation. The suspect was likely armed and had the advantage of terrain. He had been evading notice for decades. A direct armed approach could easily go wrong. She needed to be sure. She organized a flyover with the California Highway Patrol, ostensibly for a routine geological survey. She was in the helicopter, her face pressed against the glass, binoculars in hand. As they flew over the canyon of the Opal Eye Mine, she saw him. A lone figure emerged from the shadow of the cliff face, shaking his fist at the sky. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long, dark duster coat, just as Clara had described in her journal, just as he had appeared in her last ghostly photograph. Rossi focused her binoculars on his face. Even from that distance, she could see the sun glinting off the unnatural stillness of his left eye. The raid on the Opal Eye Mine was planned with the precision of a military operation. A SWAT team was assembled, flown in by helicopter to a landing zone a mile away to maintain the element of surprise. They would approach the mine on foot, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness. Detective Rossi was not on the tactical team, but she was at the forward command post, a temporary camp set up at the mouth of the canyon, listening to the radio traffic, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The team moved in, their night vision goggles turning the moonless landscape into a ghostly green world. The mine was located at the back of a box canyon, its entrance a dark maw in the cliff face, partially obscured by a ramshackle cabin built from old timbers and corrugated tin. There were no lights, no sounds, other than the wind whistling through the rocks. The team surrounded the cabin and the mine entrance. The team leader gave the order, a voice crackling over Rossi's radio. "Breach, breach, breach." The sound of a battering ram splintering the cabin door was followed by a volley of shouts. "Sheriff's Department, show us your hands." But the cabin was empty. It was a workshop, not a home. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of minerals, rocks of every shape and size, and a collection of old handmade tools. On a large workbench in the center of the room, held in a vise, was a piece of sandstone. Half finished, a new symbol was being carved into its surface. It was the same private, violet language Rossi had seen in Clara's photographs. The curator was not in the cabin. The team moved to the mine entrance. A heavy, iron-gated door, salvaged from some long-forgotten jail, blocked the way. It was locked with a massive, antique padlock. After cutting through the lock with a power saw, a sound that echoed unnervingly through the canyon, the team entered the mine. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decay. The main tunnel was 100 yards long and opened into a larger chamber, a natural cavern that had been expanded by the original miners, and it was here that they found the curator's museum. The walls of the cavern were lined with shelves, just like the cabin. But these shelves did not hold rocks. They held personal belongings: a worn leather backpack, a pair of faded hiking boots, a single silver earring, a child's stuffed animal. Each item, Rossi would later realize, was a trophy from a life he had collected. In the center of the cavern, on a large, flat rock that served as a display table, was a collection of cameras, most of them old and damaged. Among them was a newer model, a Digito SLR with a cracked lens. It was Clara's. And in the far corner of the cavern, sitting in a rough-hewn chair next to a small, smoldering fire, was the man himself. He was old, gaunt, with a long gray beard. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't resist. As the team took him into custody, he looked at them with his one good eye, a flicker of something that looked like amusement in its depths. His glass eye, a swirl of blue and white, stared blankly ahead. He was booked under his legal name, which was found on a faded driver's license in his cabin, Silas Croft. He had a record, but it was from 50 years ago, a dishonorable discharge from the military, a few arrests for assault. For the last 4 decades, he had been a ghost. His interrogation was unlike any Rossi had ever conducted. He was not silent, nor was he boastful. He spoke in a calm, detached monotone, as if he were a professor delivering a lecture. He confirmed that he was the curator. He explained his philosophy. The desert was a sacred place, and most people who entered it were in flaws, blemishes on its perfection. His job was to remove them. He would stalk them, learn their habits, and then, when the time was right, he would collect them. He saw it not as murder, but as a form of curation, of maintaining the purity of his museum. He admitted to collecting more than a dozen people over the years, their disappearances written off as accidents, the desert swallowing the evidence. He told them where some of the bodies were buried, in the labyrinth of tunnels that branched off from the main cavern of his mind. Then Rossi asked him about Clara Hayes. A different look came into his eye. She was different, he said, his voice softening for the first time. She wasn't an inflaw. She understood the rocks. She spoke the language. I didn't want to collect her. I wanted her to be part of the museum, a living exhibit. He described how he had held her captive in a deeper part of the mine for weeks. He would bring her rocks and they would talk about geology. He thought she was coming to understand his worldview, that she was becoming part of his collection willingly. But she had been planning her escape. One day, while he was out, she managed to break free. He tracked her, of course. He was the master of this domain. He found her miles away, near death from dehydration, desperately trying to hide her journal in the old gas can. She was strong, Silas said, a hint of admiration in his voice. She walked right into the sun. I let the desert have her back. It was a more fitting end for someone who loved it so much. He refused to say where her body was. He claimed he didn't know, that he had simply watched her walk away until she was a small dot in the shimmering heat, and then she was gone. The aftermath of Silas Croft's arrest was a grim, logistical nightmare. For months, forensic teams worked in the Opal Eye mine, recovering the remains of his victims. The items in his museum were used to identify more than a dozen missing persons cases from 3 states, some dating back to the 1980s. The story of the curator of Death Valley became a national sensation, a tale of Gothic horror played out against the stark beauty of the American West. Silas Croft was found competent to stand trial. He showed no remorse, sitting through the testimony of the victims' families with the same detached curiosity he had shown in his interrogation room. He was found guilty on multiple counts of murder and kidnapping and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, a cage of concrete and steel, a world away from the vast, open spaces he had once commanded. For most of the families, the verdict brought a form of closure, a painful but necessary end to decades of uncertainty. But not for Martin Hayes. The curator was in a cage, but the desert still held his daughter. The one victory he could claim was the recovery of her camera. The final images on the memory card were not landscapes. They were dark, blurry shots taken inside the mine. But the very last photo was different. It was a self-portrait, taken at arm's length. Clara's face was gaunt, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. She was staring directly into the lens, and in that final, silent image, she was not a victim. She was a witness, leaving one last piece of testimony, one final entry in her story. Martin had the photo framed. It sat on his desk next to the recovered journal. They were the only artifacts he had left, the testament of a daughter who had gone to find the Earth's jewels and had instead found its deepest darkness. The desert never gave up her body. It kept her, just as it kept its other secrets, under the watchful, silent gaze of the sun. The story was over, but the silence that remained felt heavier than before.